Now, welcome everyone to the 31st virtual roundtable on measuring corruption. I'm quite glad to have with us today Irene Tello Arista from Central European University, who will be giving a really interesting presentation on the work that she's been conducting on her PhD dissertation. I was fortunate to see some preliminary progress of her research last year at the ICRN Forum, and I know that there has been a lot of work done since then. So I look very much forward to learning about the topic as much as you are, I'm sure. Before I give her the floor, just a couple of things about how the event will be carried out. Um, it will last 90 minutes, as you know. Instead of dividing it between 45 minutes of presentation and later the Q&A, we encourage participants to ask questions and make comments if you feel the need to at that moment. So please don't be shy. If you would like to interrupt the conversation so that you can ask a question or again participate, we really welcome that. It makes for a much more interesting meeting. I will be making a lot of interruption as well. So if you want to participate, just raise your hand or click the emoji of the hand being raised, and I'll invite you to unmute yourself and participate. Otherwise, please make sure to keep your microphone off. And if for some reason you need to leave the meeting and then come back, make sure that when you come back, the microphone remains off. Okay? Just one last thing, if at any point you wish to participate, at least the first time, please, if you could introduce yourself very quickly, your affiliation, and your area of expertise, and anything else that you would like to share with us. All right, so that's pretty much it from me. I leave the floor to Irene. Irene, please, if you could also start by, giving a little bit of a self-introduction, and then feel free to start sharing your screen whenever you're ready.
Of course. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Like Joseph says, Irene Tello Arista. I'm currently in Mexico right now, but right now I'm doing the PhD at Vienna at Central European University with Professor Mihai Fazekas. But I've been working in anti-corruption efforts for a long time. Actually, before doing the PhD, I was the executive director of an NGO in Mexico, and we looked into corruption cases in Mexico, particularly in the health sector. So that's what it got me interested in looking on how we can actually use beneficial ownership data for anti-corruption purposes, because we did an investigation to try to look at how shell companies were being used all around Mexico to diversify public funds. We found evidence of over 22,000 fake invoices that were paid to several health institutions. And in the end, we only had the name of the companies and not of the people who actually benefited from them. So that's why in Mexico, we still don't have a public beneficial ownership register. But in many European countries, they have it since 2015. So I think it's a great time to start analyzing if this transparency policy has been working and how to use this information to actually make risk indicators that could actually help us, all of us that are actually trying to do something about anti-corruption efforts. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Let me see. Do you see it now?
Yes, perfect.
Let me just, because I'm having, because I have two monitors and then it would seem like but well, this is a paper that we are doing, not only me, but also with Professor Mihai Fazekas and Antonina Volkotrup. She's in the Anti-Corruption Action Center, an NGO based in Ukraine. And basically, what I'm going to try to show you today is, well, first the motivations that got us, the three of us, into this topic, some of the conceptual framework and the expectations we were actually trying to see we could be proved with the methods, the data and the methods we used, the results, and some open questions and next steps that we're actually thinking. We already have the working paper out. I'm going to try to share the link in the chat in a while, but I'm going to start. And like Joseph said, if you have any questions in the middle of the presentation, I think please just feel free to ask it alongside. So basically, the personal motivation I told you is I really want to see how beneficial ownership data can be used for anti-corruption efforts. But when we started doing like the analysis of the papers of how beneficial ownership data has been used for this purpose, we found that there's still evidence lacking of how it can actually be used for these purposes. At first, it was all said that it was going to be a great transparency policy, but there has been no many papers written to try to actually test how we can use this data and the data that is actually available to actually conduct risk measurements on corruption. Of course, there are many papers that have been talking about why it's important to have access to the real owners of companies, how it's important to have this information open and available to a lot of individuals. But like I said, very few papers. There's one very famous about the end of London Rat, where some researchers actually used the information on the new beneficial ownership register that was created in London after the war in Ukraine started to try to avoid using real estate in the UK as a way of money laundering. So in the way this new beneficial ownership register was created, and what they did with this policy was that any real estate now in the UK that wants to be sold or bought, they have to actually disclose who is buying that real estate. And the researchers found that with this new policy, at least the number of beneficial ownership that were not known was reduced, and also the market in a way stalled, because of course we know that many real estate in London is currently being used for money laundering purposes. So we know that these policies, if they are designed well, they can work. But unfortunately, it's so difficult to actually analyze all the information that is in these registers that we found a lot of missing data, of incorrect data, of invalid data that also brings like a new opportunity for investigators to see if the quality of the data that we have currently could be used for risk purposes as it is right now. So this was the motivation in the first place. Basically, what we try to do in this paper is, lay the groundwork for emerging literature that uses beneficial ownership data set for risk assessment. But also we had two main hypotheses or things that objectives that we wanted to try out. We wanted to do or conduct validity testing on common suggested indicators of ownership risks. Basically, what we did is analyze the literature regarding ownership risk of what could be considered an ownership risk, the age of the owner, where does it live, where does it reside. And we are trying to actually conduct validity testing by seeing if those ownership risks actually correlate with some other risk indicators of corruption that have already been tested for a while, like the corruption risk index that I'm going to present in a while. But also we wanted to generate hypotheses of how the different networks of corruption that use companies in a way for conducting corruption and money laundering are actually using ownership schemes to try to hide the real owners of the people that are benefiting from these schemes. So basically, we wanted to do both. We wanted to test what is actually being done in the literature, but we also looked at many corruption cases that have been uncovered by journalists and by many other NGOs all over the world to see if some of these patterns can actually be detected in the data that beneficial ownership registers have. To do this, we have 6 countries. They're all, in a very broad sense, European countries, because like I told you, Europe was in the front line of actually having this transparency policy in place. I think Ukraine was the first country in the whole world having it. Very afterwards, the UK has its own beneficial ownership register. So we did like an analysis of all the policies involved in the creation of these registers, because we also wanted to have a mix of countries, not only because we needed the data, we needed procurement data and beneficial ownership data that could be actually be matched, but we also needed countries that have different levels of corruption, or what I'm going to start defining, and also, but in a way, very similar institutional frameworks that could actually make the comparisons relatable. So this is something that we started looking. We're looking for Denmark, Estonia, Latvia, Slovakia, Ukraine, and the UK. The time frame, it varies by country, but I'm going to go into that. And like I've been telling you and trying to start explaining, the conceptual framework that we have is if some risky ownership features correlate with a higher likelihood for a financial crime, either money laundering or corruption. In this particular case, what we're actually trying to correlate it is with corruption risk in public procurement. So what we're trying to see this is the idea behind this is if a company is doing something corrupt in a public procurement process, even though the company structure or ownership can appear legitimate, we're trying to see if the data that is in the beneficial ownership data sets has some ownership risks that have been identified in the literature and in other cases. Like I told you, maybe they have very young owners that could actually be saying that they put the sons as the owners of the company when they are a politically exposed person. Maybe the owners are a politically exposed person and they are winning contracts, and that's something that also needs to be identified. Maybe the company is very young and it's just winning a contract that maybe doesn't have the trajectory to actually do what the contract says of the public procurement processes. So this is what the conceptual framework we're trying to do. We're conducting validity testing. So basically we want to see if a company is risky, if it is more likely to participate in corrupt or more risky, in corrupt procurement tenders. But we also knew that, unfortunately, given how difficult it is to actually have the data of who are the real owners of these companies, then maybe some outliers, missing information would also be very useful information for us to actually detect patterns of risk. So one of the indicators that we're actually also measuring as a risk of ownership is having no beneficial data at all. So we're also trying to see, because we know that unfortunately, it's so easy to create a company in many places. Like countries have this double problem of trying to promote investment and having very little barriers for people to actually open a company. But in the other way, they also have to have that transparency and anti-money laundering policies in place. So we know that it's very easy to start creating these very complex schemes where you have a company that is owned by another company, to try to hide the people that are actually benefiting from these schemes, or also have a company that it's actually settled in an offshore country where transparency regulations are actually not as good as the countries where they're actually trying to win the procurement process, in a way also to hide the real beneficiaries of these companies. So we are trying to see if the information in the BO actually is valid to actually conduct validity testing and risks indicators of ownership.
Irene, may I interrupt here? I have a couple of questions. Could we go back to the previous slide?
Of course.
Thank you. And please, if the question that I have is something that you already addressed in a later slide, please just ignore my question. But I was wondering if you could take us a little bit through rather kind of like a basic introduction to the idea of beneficial ownership registers, especially for some of us that may not be completely, I mean, for the most part, we have heard about it. But for example, sometimes it might not be completely clear if countries that, for example, have for many years public contractor registries, if they are counted as a beneficial ownership registry, or what is the relationship between the two. You mentioned registers of politically exposed persons. I know that, I mean, they're certainly not the same, but as I understand, they have encountered over the last few years a number of similar challenges in terms of where does that information to build that register come from? Is that something that people have been requesting or demanding the state to take charge of, or is it something that normally the private sector through different companies or even non-governmental organizations take care of? So you could give us a little bit of a primer on BO registers. I think that could potentially bring everybody on the same page.
Of course. And yeah, sorry that I went so fast on that part. Basically, beneficial ownership registers, at least in Europe, started being created after the fourth anti-money laundering directive was published. And this anti-money laundering directive actually mandated that states, the European states, to have a central beneficial ownership register that actually detected or had a register of who was the owners of the companies. when we talk about beneficial ownership, we have to talk about control and ownership, because of course, sometimes you cannot say that you own because you don't have the shares or you don't own it, but in a way you are the responsible of putting the board of directors and have all the control of the company. And that also counts as being as the beneficial ownership of a company. This is a very interesting and complex case because each country has their own regulations of how to define who is a beneficial owner. In the end, they set up like a threshold of if you own or control more than 25% of a company, you are considered a beneficial owner of that company. And they are also trying, it came the fifth anti-money laundering directive that asked all the states to have these registers public, because the idea was as more people and more institutions, because of course, this information is not only valuable for law enforcement, for people involved in procurement processes, also journalists, NGOs could actually benefit from the information and actually try to help validate if the information is up to date and current. So, but unfortunately, on November 2022, the European Court actually ruled that it was actually going against data protection issues, having these registers public. So now many countries in Europe or shut down the access to these registers, which is a great problem. But I think with the sixth anti-money laundering directive, what is being trying to be done is to get again access, then more people have access to it, because in the ruling of the court, it said that only actors that had, I'm forgetting right now the word because it's a very peculiar word, but yeah, that only had, but well, I'll remember it. You have to show that you have a legitimate interest and a legitimate purpose to access this information. But this actually created a problematic thing, because what we're trying to do, and also I think this paper actually proves, is that as more actors are involved with the quality of the data sets and use them, it can actually be better for the purpose that they were created, to try to deter these companies to being used for financial crimes. And yes, they have to be done by the state. It's a mandate for the states.
Thank you. That certainly clarifies, especially what is the situation in Europe concerning these registries. Santiago, I saw that you also wanted to participate. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Joseph. I actually jumped the gun a bit because I was about to ask about how the ruling from the Court of Justice, actually, if you incorporated it in your analysis, and it was very interesting to see that you did. So very much looking forward to reading the paper as well.
Thank you. Yeah, for me it was because I started my PhD in actually September 2022, and I wanted to look at beneficial ownership registers in Europe. And in November, they said that they were going to close down the register. So it was a challenge, but we're trying to work towards it and see, because different countries are reacting differently to this ruling, and some of them are keeping the access open, waiting for the sixth anti-money laundering directive. I think there was another question.
Beatriz?
Yes, hello, Rene. My name is Beatriz Aguedo. I'm a PhD student at Kyoto University. I research about compliance, integrity, and corruption. And I had a question about your previous slide where you were describing the characteristics of, the countries that you work with. I wanted to ask you about this beneficial ownership registry. Does it have, or is it like the information is connected with the public registry information or the tax authorities in each country? Because I was wondering about the characteristics of this, of how they were established. Like, it was like an isolated, like companies, they needed to register, put the information there, or there was like an interconnection where there was a cross-validity within institutions. How did you, found this new registry was established?
It varies by country, but yeah, many countries, like Joseph said, because you already had before company registers for procurement processes to actually, to found the company and legally. And many countries have it interrelated with the company's registers house. But it's a different thing because here it's not about who is the director or who appears as the founder of the company, but who actually, like I told you, benefits from the company. So there are also exclusions to being in a beneficial ownership register. So if you are a company that is in a stock exchange, they assume because they have to go through so many transparency procedures that they, and sometimes, like I told you, like there are so many stocks on a company that you don't know all of the owners. So you also have to put that in place. Like I told you, for them, it's like over 25% of ownership or control. It also could be direct control or indirect control. This also comes into into consideration. It's a very interesting policy that has been evolved because I think what I'm trying to do, at least in my PhD, is to see the impact that this policy has, because of course corruption networks adapt their behaviors to still comply with these transparency policies. So there are many cases where we are seeing that owners are reducing the shares of ownership or control to be under the threshold of 25%, so they don't have to be declared as a beneficial ownership. So these policies have been trying to evolve to try to also keep up to date with these new trends of the networks that are still using companies for money laundering and corruption purposes, and to still have a register that it's up to date and useful for the different authorities that have access to it. I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah, it depends on the country.
Definitely. But I mean, I just to maybe ask something directly. Did you find in any of these countries like a relation to the tax authorities? Because there was this American law, the FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, that, as you mentioned, they point out that they need to get. Well, this law is supposed to catch if the company has an American, United States beneficial owner, and they use this term. So I was wondering if within any of these countries is they would already have this information, because this law, well, at least for all tax authorities, well, all countries had to implement it within their tax administration or within the Ministry of Economy. So it will be a nice source to get this information, because I mean, every country has like interpreted by itself, but for example, then it forces people, companies, banks especially, to catch up in bank accounts of most corporations and to inform this to the government. But from the other side, not of course from this registry, but from another angle. Did you find any of this? Did you find any of these cases? I was curious.
One of the recommendations that we do is because many of the beneficial ownership registers do have the company ID, and the company ID is completely related with the tax ID. So this ID is super important, because that's what actually allows you to match it with other data sets that are relatable and very useful, like tax declarations, the procurement processes that were won by that company, and many, either the procurement data set or the beneficial ownership didn't have that ID. So then the matching had to be done by company name, which is like, I don't know if you have done matching. It creates a horrible scenario, because then you have to lower cases, see if the name is actually written in the both data sets at the same time. So the matching rate goes down in a very proportionate case. But yeah, I think the ID, the company ID, was one of the things we found that would be super useful for new policies like the one in the United States that is actually being done right now. Because with that, you can start having the trace of not only the company's taxes, but then of the people that benefit from that company, to get the tax IDs of those people.
Amazing. Thank you, Irene.
No, you're welcome.
Alberto?
Thanks, Joseph. Sorry, Alberto's here. I'm working with the World Bank in South Africa. I really want to let you go on with your presentation, but just something that struck me looking at the country case studies again. If I look at Denmark, Estonia, Latvia, the UK even, these are among the least corrupt countries in the world. I mean, Ukraine is maybe the one exception here. So just a question on the way that has affected some of the corruption risk validation work that you've had. So it's kind of a comment on kind of your experience, but also the case selections and the effect of being able to determine whether corrupt networks are really changing when some of these countries probably don't have massive corrupt networks. Thanks.
Yes, one of the first reasons why we chose these countries was because data availability. If you don't have data from procurement from a very for several years to match with beneficial ownership registers, this kind of analysis would be not comparable. So that was one of the first things. But on the other side, because we're measuring actually corruption risks in public procurement, all of these countries have corruption risks and a varying degree of corruption risk, at least in public procurement. So I think that we still can analyze that. I think when we think about corruption, we normally think about the corruption perception index or other kinds of corruption, and we don't look into how, unfortunately, in many countries, and this is one of the reasons we always want to study this, because I think in European countries, still corruption acts are part of the procurement processes, but they have developed ways of being kept under the radar. Or that's what we're trying to see, that maybe sometimes they win the procurement contract and then some of the remnants of the corruption case are taken outside of the country. So that's why I think what we're trying to do is start looking at these data sets from a transnational level, because one of the things that we were trying to wonder if many corruption networks that are operating in place don't actually abuse, that many people don't actually match different data sets from different countries to try to detect these bigger patterns. But yeah, at least for corruption risk indicators in public procurement, all of the countries we found had them.
I would like to add one point to that, if I may, because that point from Alberto is quite interesting as well, of course. In that, if we consider such indices as the CPI, right? Indeed, these are the least corrupt countries in the world for the most part, and with potentially the exception of Ukraine. But I think that a better index here to match the type of data that we're looking at would be the Financial Secrecy Index, produced by Tax Justice Network. And in that case, because that basically what they're measuring is the level of secrecy or lack of transparency in these international financial transactions, right? The United Kingdom actually has the 13th rank, which puts it as one of the less transparent countries and potentially host for a lot of the type of difficulties that Irene will be exploring during her presentation, I'm sure. But I just wanted to share that the little bit of information. Irene, please.
Thank you so much. So like I told you, after analyzing several papers regarding ownership risks, but also cases of corruption that have been uncovered by journalists and NGOs and other investigative sources, we come up with these indicators because we not only had to found them in the literature, but be able to measure them with the beneficial ownership data available. So in the end, what we're trying to analyze in this paper is the company frequency by beneficial ownership, or how many companies a beneficial ownership owns, the changes in beneficial ownership information. So basically, if they're changing in a way to avoid sanctions, or maybe the government changes and they're trying to change who is the beneficial ownership publicly register, because they trying to win new public contracts. So that's also a risk indicator of ownership. Having no beneficial ownership information also counts for us as a risk, because that would be like the most evident way to try to hide who is the owner of the companies. The age of the beneficial owners, because in many cases we're seeing that either people that are not related to companies. In Mexico, we had a case where a very big corruption scandal where very poor elders from rural provinces were actually the owners of these massive companies, and they were just being paid to be put in the paper. Of course, they didn't know they were the owners of these companies, just to try to hide who were actually the owners of these companies. But also it happens that they put their children as the owners of these companies to try to avoid the trace, but also keep the familiar ties in place of these companies that are being used for financial crimes. we're trying to test this, and this was like the most problematic risk indicators of all, regarding the countries of the beneficial owner. Either if the nationality or the residence, if they're foreign from the public procurement contract one, if they're from China, because China appears in many sanctions lists and in many investigations like the Panama Papers and Pandora Papers, many owners were also related to China. If they're from a sanctions country, we're only taking into consideration Russia, Belarus, and Iran. And if they're from offshore jurisdictions. Of course, I know when we talk about offshore jurisdictions, a whole new discussion can emerge, because what is actually, like Joseph said, taken into consideration as an offshore jurisdiction. We use the consensus list. That is a list that I can show you later that has been used for several papers. So many of the countries involved there were considered as an offshore jurisdiction. The age of the company in years when the contract was won, and if the beneficial ownership is a politically exposed person. This information we only had for Ukraine, because in Ukraine, the NGO where Antonina is working has a data set of politically exposed persons that participate in public procurement processes. So that's the only country where we could actually do it. But these are the indicators that we're going to try to analyze. This is, I think I've been talking a lot. So 6 countries for the period of 2009 to 2021. It varies by countries because not many countries have the available data sets to do the matching of procurement data set and beneficial ownership data sets. The data sets are being used from Open Tender EU, at least for public procurement processes. And for beneficial ownership registers, we use information from Open Ownership Register and from the national registers of the countries. The data merging process, like I told you, has to do first with the ID of the companies. This was the first step done when the ID of the company was available. And the second step was by company name-based matching. Unfortunately, when it had to be done by company name-based matching, like I told you, the matching rates went down in a very strong proportion. This is, you can see at least the years analyzed for each of the countries, the number of companies in the register that we had available, the number of bids, and the number of bids and percentage of bids that actually had a beneficial ownership. So the matching rate of all of the countries. Estonia is the one that had the best information, at least for this matching process. So that's why the information in Estonia was so high, the matching rate. And for the dependent variable, you're using linear regressions, is the corruption risk index. I don't know, I think you had Mishi in one of your talks, Joseph, but I'm going to try to explain it. Basically, what Professor Fachekas did was try to develop a proxy indicator of corruption that looks into some of the data available in public procurement data sets to try to analyze risk in corruption in public procurement. So if you have a single bidding, if the time between when it's actually announced and given the tender, it's very short, there's a set of data and indicators that compose the corruption risk index. In the end, it's an index that goes from 0 to 1, 1 being the highest risk indicator. This risk was analyzed for all of the countries that we are analyzing in this paper. For not all the countries all the corruption risk index could be done. For example, in Ukraine after the war, many of the data of procurement data was taken down, and also beneficial ownership register in Ukraine had to be taken down because it contains personal information. But we had some access to one of the last dumps they had before the war started, so that's why it was actually analyzed. But yeah, as the dependent variable, we're using the corruption risk index that tries to analyze corruption risk in public procurement process to see if it relates to some of these ownership risk indicators that I explained before. The methods we're trying to be keep it.
I'm sorry, may I interrupt? I have a couple of questions actually. Could you go back to the previous slide? And I apologize in advance. You'll notice a lot of the questions are about the nature of the data. I think a number of people who are usual participants in this type of meetings are very interested in exploring the details of data. So because one of your indicators is specifically related to the quality of the contracts or the period between the time in which the company was registered or created and the time when they won a public contract, right? So does this mean that this corruption risk index, so the risk of corruption in public contracting, is this created or produced for every single contract? Or is this a measurement at a country level?
We did two analyses, first at the country level, and then we had to do by year to see if the patterns change depending on the rates by country, to see if it was actually measuring something. And we found that, by year also changes the risk correlated to the corruption risk indicator and the ownership risk. So in the end, even though it's contract level, actually the problem is not that it's contract level on the CRI, but that we're actually analyzing information of individuals. So in the end, we had to take the maximum and minimum values of the beneficial ownership data. I think that's the real problem right now we're facing when we're actually measuring contract level information, but beneficial ownership information, it's in the personal level. So right now we had to take minimum and maximum values. This is like the new step forward to try to see how we can actually use there are many other instances. I'm looking now into how actually pandemics are being analyzed, because in the end you have different levels of observation, but you have to still be able to match the risks with these two levels.
And thank you. And a second question relates to the slide that is before this one, where the details about the number of companies in the beneficial ownership register. I find this very insightful because, of course, there's a significant difference in the size of the economy of each one of these countries, and I guess to a degree that is also reflected in the numbers, such as, for example, for UK, we see here that it has over 8 million companies in the register, right? But then there are other surprising, well, at least I guess to me, surprising information in that I see Ukraine has, how much is this? 2 million?
Million.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite large. At least I wouldn't say exactly where the number comes from. Potentially, it's again in issues related to law enforcement. But I'm curious about when it comes to the processing of the data. Could you give us a little bit of insights about if there was a significant, if there were issues associated with the quality of the data, is these issues found across the countries, or these country-specific problems that you found in the data even before conducting the correlation or regression analysis? If this is something, of course, that is the result of your analysis as well, then please ignore my question. You can address it later. But anything that you could tell us about how you manage the data prior to the analysis would be very useful.
Yes, there have to be many steps involved to actually conduct the matching of both of the data sets. The procurement process data, I think, has been worked for a while, a lot in Open Tender EU, but at least for the beneficial ownership data, a lot of things had to be done. I think in your first question regarding the difference of companies, you can also see the different trajectories that countries have been trying to take with this transparency policy. So in Ukraine, because they were the first and they have been trying to push a lot for transparency regarding this, we have seen that the quality of the data sets, at least before the war, was really high. So they had all the companies' IDs for the procurement process and also for the beneficial ownership register. And also they have a new policy in place that companies could actually be banned from a procurement process if they don't disclose their beneficial owner. So I think that's why you see a bigger number of companies registering the beneficial ownership register in Ukraine. This is something that we're trying, or at least I'm trying to take note of, because for the recommendation of countries that are actually creating their own beneficial ownership registers right now, I think this information is very important, because in the end, I think it's how you design the policy that actually helps you see how effective the data you're going to have. So we had many issues in the quality of the data sets. It varies across countries. I think, like I told you, Estonia was one of the with the better quality data sets. In the UK, because we didn't have the company ID, I think for procurement processes, the matching was really difficult because it had to be done by name. And then you have the problem, like I told you, of what you do with the different names that are from different companies but have the same name or have the limited or incorporated written in different ways. So I think that we have a lot of no BO data also because, of course, if you don't have enforcement in place of sanctions or some kind of regulations that happens when companies don't actually disclose their beneficial owners, you have a lot of missing data. So yeah, I think the next step for us is to try to show the different quality of the data sets, or at least that's one of my second paper is going to be based on that, like show the different quality data sets that we have and what we can do, even though we have different quality in the data, to still try to analyze and see this data, because I think in the end, they reflect the pattern that the policy has taken, but also of the corruption that in each country takes place. I don't know if I'm explaining.
Follow-up question to that one, because the point about the names I find always quite interesting. As you know, we have had also presentations in this series from researchers using, for example, news data and other unstructured sources, which is not exactly this, of course, but one issue that seems to be very recurrent is the matching of names for the same individual, right? Because in different register or from different sources of information, the name may have issues with the spelling of it, or the middle name might not be included. Is this something also that when processing the data before the analysis, something that you looked into? Was there an algorithm that allowed you to, for example, group different spellings of the same or the name of the same individual? Could you tell us something about that?
For the name, that was the second step. When we didn't have the company ID, then the name started being like the first part of the matching process. The matching was done by Antonina, but from what she told us, the lowercase was the first step. So you lower all the names. Then we had to take all the parts of limited incorporated to try to make it more precise. And then I think she also used the address of the companies to try to make the matching better. But yeah, like you said, I think it's a whole, this paper was done, I think, in a year and a half, and most of the part had to do with the matching of the data sets, because how difficult it is. And it's also one of the conclusions that we have, that if people want to actually use these data sets, if you don't have this company ID, it makes it all more difficult to actually get the most of matching both data sets.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I mean, even if your data set was 10% of the size it has, it will still be a significant challenge. So I can only imagine that, yeah, usually data scientists say that 70% of the time they take them to go through a project is in just data cleaning.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, thank you.
No, you're welcome. So like I told you, the dependent variable is a corruption risk index created by Professor Fazekas and analyzed for each of the countries. And the independent variable is each of the risk indicators that I explained before. So it's a correlation for each of the risks with the corruption risk index. We had to put many control variables because, of course, and this is something that Joseph and I have discussed, with the corruption risk index, the contract value, the market could actually influence what you're actually seeing. So that was taken as a control variable. The number of beneficial owners by company also had to be taken as a control. But now I'm going to start looking at the results. This is a table that we did just for, I think, educational purposes. So you can see in a very visual way, at least, what we have found. I think we were not, well, we were great, well, yeah, in a very good way, surprised, because we thought that many indicators were not going to work. Of course, you can see in many countries and in many indicators where the indicator can actually not be measured because of the quality of the data. We have many or very few examples, but at least we're seeing a varied example of how these indicators do work in several countries. And also we're seeing differences, which is something that we wanted to see. For example, I'm going to explain it later, but for the age of the beneficial owners, at least for Latvia and Slovakia, the older owners were the riskier. And in the UK, it was the youngest. So this is the kind of difference that I think it's very important to take into consideration. It's also the next step, at least for my dissertation, to go to the qualitative part of the interviews to see why we have those differences. Because I think if we start interviewing the people involved in the registers or analyzing corruption case in each of these countries, we can actually have better risk indicators of ownership that actually reflect what is happening at the country level. But yeah, in a way, I think we had a very good surprise of seeing that many of the risk indicators of beneficial ownership, at least how many companies a beneficial ownership owns, how many changes in the beneficial ownership change register were done, also work in countries. Having no BO data also works as a risk indicator. The age of the beneficial ownership also works in some countries. And the ones that actually work less, and that I think I told you before, is related to the countries of the beneficial owner, at least regarding the residence or the nationality. We think that it has to do first with the quality of the data, because you also can have a lot of nominees that are in other jurisdictions to try to avoid the risk. But when we were analyzing at least the residents for the UK, if they were foreign from China or from a sanctions country, that did work. So that's why you can see for the UK, at least for foreign and for China, that did work for residents. The year of the companies works also for Denmark and Slovakia. And like I told you, for politically exposed persons, we can only do this for Ukraine, but that also works as a risk indicator. I'm going to go into different some of the indicators, so you can actually see it by country and by indicator. So like I told you, at least for the UK...
may
yes.
I interrupt again? Sorry.
Yes.
Could you go back to the previous slide? I really like this. Thank you. It does such a great job at summarizing so many results, and I'm sure other potentially also have questions. So you mentioned the age of the beneficial owner, right? Where indeed I see here that in UK is the younger ones that represent a risk, the older ones in Latvia and Slovakia, right? I know that potentially, I mean, in your data set you have them by name. I don't know if you're planning to publish them. Potentially no. I know that when we had Isaluna Pla and Jose presenting also on their analysis of networks of corruption in Mexico, their paper didn't include names for obvious reasons, I guess. But I wonder if you went a little bit into the data to kind of not conduct a qualitative analysis per se, of course, but just to take a look at what's happening, if you recognize some names or something to that end.
Yes, because sometimes we had outliers that were valid outliers. So for example, there were many rich people that own a huge amount of companies. And at least in Ukraine, Antonina could recognize some of them that they were billionaires in Ukraine that have so many companies. And there were the outliers in the data set that were actually creating the noise. So we actually had to look into that to see what was happening. And also because, in some instances, also for the politically exposed persons, at least for Ukraine, she knew of cases where politically exposed persons had contracts, at least for oil and gas, at least she told us in Ukraine, that were persons in government that have oil contracts, and that journalists have been investigated that were not the best contracts, and the prices were sometimes overpriced and not the best quality of the contract. So we had to look into this to see if we were actually looking at some corruption cases or not. Not for all the cases, because of course the data but for outliers we had to look into what was happening to see if it was noise or if it was actually something that it was being measured.
Thank you. That makes sense. I mean, I just continue looking at this table and going back to the age in Slovakia, I mean, that's quite particularly high in terms of age, right? 78 and up. And in
Yeah.
UK, it's completely the opposite. I mean, 37 and less. I don't know what is the youngest example that you found in your data set, but yeah, I do get, I guess, to a certain degree, it's intuitive, because I would assume that, and perhaps this is an empirical question. What is the, I don't know if you have this information at hand, but in terms of the description of the data, what is the mean age of beneficial owners in the UK, for example, if these risky ones are no older than 37 years old, is this significantly different to the mean age for them?
We have that in the paper, at least like the mean of all the ages. I don't know if by country, but at least by indicator. I'm going to, look now at the link. So you can look, because we also have to look, at the data sets that we have, and by each indicator to analyze, like what was the quality of the data, like who were the youngest, who were the oldest, and then also to make the division, because the idea was also that, of course, there are many owners that are legitimate owners, so that would not measure any risk in the corruption risk index. So we had to fracture the data sets to have like first, like 10 values of the data set, and then also a missing category to also see if the missing was actually more related to a corruption risk, and then to analyze which of the parts of the data set that we have related to beneficial owner pose the greatest risk for each of the indicators.
Thank you. Nicolás?
Yes, many thanks, Irene, for your presentation. Just one question and one comment. The question, all countries have different laws. Then, although the big issue is public procurement, beneficial ownership, I wanted to know if you faced difficulties in order to make the comparison. In short, how did you avoid to make comparison, to make mistakes comparing different laws? Because maybe at the big glance, maybe just crimes could be the same, or the beneficial ownership could be the same, but maybe in details, just each country has its own rules in order to define how this issue is going to be handled. Then I wanted to know if how did you face how to handle differences in law in order to avoid that you were maybe measuring different things. That's the question. And the comment, I do not know if you have thought on observing specifically the position of the countries that you have studied, because at least as a first glance in the results, it's just a supposition. I can observe that the assumptions worked the most in the UK, because the UK is an internationalized country, a lot of global business, etc. But maybe in those countries that are not so internationalized as the UK, then the assumptions did not work properly. Then my comment is I do not know if it could be useful for you not only to be focused on the statistics, but also on the position of each country, because if it is the case, maybe we can assume that our assumptions are based on those countries more included in the global system, but maybe we know we need more research for those cases, for those countries that are not so internationalized, and maybe there the risks are others. And many thanks for your presentation, Irene.
Thank you, Nicolás. I think for the first information, we had to analyze the laws involved, at least for beneficial ownership registers. I think the thing that we had in our favor is because of the anti-money laundering directive. UK was also part of it, and I think in that time, they had all the state parties of the European Union to have these registers in place, so they couldn't go very straight from what the anti-money laundering directive have. So the regulations are very similar in all of them, even though they have some changes. So we could compare it. Regarding public procurement processes, this is something that Professor Fachekas has studied for many years. What he does is he analyzes the difference in the laws of each of the countries to analyze the corruption risk index. This is something that we discussed with Joseph because, yeah, of course, having a single bidder doesn't have to be a synonym of corruption. And that's why he has several indicators of corruption risks that are measured together. Depending on the laws of the country, what the public procurement law says in the countries, these indicators are actually tailored. So, example, if the submission of the contract in certain country, they give, like 3 months, then it's tailored. So I can actually say, okay, if it's given in a week, then it's the risk. But yeah, this varies by country. And I know it's a very polemic thing to be talking about, but I think in the end, what we're trying to analyze more is if many, and I'm going to your second question, if many of the ownership risks that have been uncovered by journalist investigations like the Panama Papers, Pandora Papers, and unfortunately, this speaks to what you were trying to tell me, this kind of schemes where companies are being used not only to win contracts illegally, but also to do money laundering have been happening in many countries. I think in all of the countries all over the world, unfortunately. So I think it doesn't have to be of the position that the UK has as a center of investment, but unfortunately, companies are being used all over the world because it's so easy to create them to for corruption in public procurement and to money launder that ill-gotten wealth of different financial crimes. Also for tax evasion purposes, companies are being used. So what we're trying to do right now is to actually analyze which ownership indicators could be used to start developing risk indicators of ownership. This is just the first start. But in the end, what we're seeing is what the literature says. You can see it here also. And it's not only for the UK. You can see it for Denmark, for Estonia, for Latvia, for Ukraine, for Slovakia and UK. So I think it has more to do with the quality of the data that you have for each of the countries. And yeah, I also agree that now we have to go into the qualitative part to actually understand the difference that we're measuring. But I think, unfortunately, all of the countries analyzed, and I think all of the countries all over the world use companies as a way to money launder and conduct corruption.
Irene, talking about the difference between the countries, could you just confirm something that I was just wondering? Does the British Register include the British overseas territories?
The what? Sorry?
That the UK register and the data set, does that include beneficial ownership from British overseas territories? Because as we know, the UK has, I mean, a lot of the problem that it has with money laundering is in connection to its overseas territories.
I think for not all of them, from what I understand. But this is a great question. I'm going to look into it. But yeah, because for us also, it's like a main red flag.
But I was wondering, does the regulation or the register that was created in a country and your data set that is are companies registered in, for example, those territories, are they included in here or do they fall outside of the created register?
I think I have to look into it because many countries also said that if you participate in the public procurement process, it doesn't matter where you're based, you have to be declaring the beneficial ownership register. And the UK has two beneficial ownership registers. One is the general one, and then one that is called the People with Significant Control, that was created after the war in Ukraine was created. And that was created also for real estate money laundering issues. So that was actually created for, like I told you, to declare the beneficial owners of companies or people that wanted to buy or sell real estate in London.
Thank you. No, that absolutely clarifies it. You're right. I mean, as long as they're contracting with the state, they need to be registered regardless. Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. And they have actually, this is something that many policies have. The beneficial owner has to be a natural person, because many companies say that the owner is another company. And of course, for this policy, that doesn't count. So you have to actually say who is the natural person owning more than 25% or controlling more than 25% of the company.
I do have questions about the enforcement capacity, but I think that that's better to leave for the end of the presentation.
If I have questions?
No, I have questions about the enforcement capacity in these different states. But again, maybe that's something that we can tackle at the end of the presentation.
No, yeah, whatever, because I also have this is for me like the issue. Like, who are the authorities responsible and how well they validate the data that they have. But I don't know if I think I cannot see the chat. I saw there were many things when I saw.
No, only I'm following the chat. People just congratulating you for the presentation, and some of them had to leave early, but no, please continue.
Well, this is, like I told you, like the visual representation of the whole, because I think in a way you can see it. Like I told you, at least for the number of companies owned by the same beneficial owner in the UK, what we found is that the risk goes up from having 9 companies to 1,000, and like that's what you were talking about, Joseph, like the outliers. So yeah, I think it would, for this case, the 10% of the values that we have is the riskiest for the UK in the number of companies owned by the same beneficial owner. For the relation between the corruption risk index and the number of changes to beneficial ownership information for Estonia, what we found is also the outliers, which may not seem like an outlier, but yeah, like when you have 3 to 7 changes, then the risk of corruption in public procurement went up. To having no beneficial ownership data, this is something that I think where you have real quality information, when you don't find the beneficial owner, it does work. Because like I told you, in Ukraine, because companies can be banned from public procurement process if they don't declare the beneficial owner, I think the quality of the data set is higher. So that's why I think we see in Ukraine that it's more correlated with a higher corruption risk where they don't identify the beneficial owner than in the other countries where we are actually not sure if what we're seeing is companies that are not complying with the regulation, even though no corruption is taking place or no corruption risk is taking place. This is what I was telling you about the difference of the age of the beneficial owner. So this is something that you said, for Latvia, at least, is the oldest or the highest percentage of the data of beneficial ownership data that pose the greatest risk. So it's between 71 and 86 years. For the UK, like I told you, and I don't remember if I have it here. No, sorry. Is the youngest one, and then you can see it in the other table. These are the difference that actually, for me, are very fascinating, because they actually explain the difference of the risks that we're having or seeing that talks about what is happening in the country level. So that's what I'm going to do right now, to see what is happening in the country level with the implementation of the policy, but also with different corruption and money laundering schemes, to try to see if the risk indicators could be tailored to be context dependent, because I think every risk indicator has to be context dependent. And what we're seeing right now is, at least for the age, it's different in the countries, which I think is a good sign. But we have to understand why and how we can actually tailor it better to measure better the risks that are happening in each country.
Am I reading this graph correctly in that in Latvia, at least, the risk index decreases for younger owners?
Yes, this is something that sometimes happened.
So it's exactly the opposite as it being found in the UK.
Yes.
Wow, that's very interesting.
Yeah, and I love this paper, but I think it opened a series of new questions, at least for me, to try to understand this, because some things you can try to understand by saying to certain hypotheses of, yes, of course, maybe in Latvia and Estonia is the same case as in Mexico, where people are being paid to be appearing as the owners, or people from the communist era that have many companies that are still involved in corruption practices. We don't know, and sometimes with these things is we don't have any idea what is actually happening, and we have to actually start conducting interviews to understand better the risk of ownership information that we're actually measuring, to tailor it better.
Was the data disaggregated also? I don't know if in the analysis, and certainly, but in the data set or in the raw data, could it be also classified or separated by sector or industry?
Right now, it had to be taken as a control variable because, like you said, but yeah, we're thinking that now another thing that we can be done is like a meso analysis and a micro analysis to understand this risk by market, by regions of each of the countries, and also to see, because right now we're analyzing 6 countries, but I think the richness of this kind of analysis is done when you can actually look into the country, in the regions and the market level to understand the difference of ownership risks.
Sounds very good. Thank you. I have a paper to recommend later.
Please.
It's almost a self-plug. Stephen Gawthorpe and I published this paper on the assessment of widespread corruption in the Czech Republic using procurement data. But it was at the subnational level, so it was really to map the concentration by different parts of the country. It wasn't separated. No, there was also a disaggregation by sector that was included in the paper. I'll send it to you. Maybe give you some ideas about how to proceed to when you continue conducting the analysis.
Yes, thank you so much. This one, the one that I think this is for residents, at least or country of residence of the beneficial owners in the UK. I think this is the one that we were more surprised it didn't work in many countries. I think in the UK it works, and this is something that Nicolas said, because of course you have a variety of actors participating from all over the world, and the quality of the data, at least for this kind of information, was higher, because in many countries we had very few beneficial owners from China or from sanctions countries. So I think in the UK you can see what Nicolas was saying, no? Because the UK is such an important center of commerce. We can actually look at these risk indicators in the UK for residents that worked, at least for China. And also I think foreign, but here it doesn't appear, but yeah, foreign owners that participated in public procurement in the UK were riskier than domestic beneficial owners in the UK. So also for the corruption risk index and the company age at the time of receiving the contract in Denmark, like I told you, the youngest companies at the time of winning the contract pose the greatest risk. And this has, of course, makes sense, because like winning a contract or a public procurement contract when you're a company that has between 0 and 3 years of age, of course, sounds like something that it's risky. And this is all risks. We're not talking about actual corruptions, even though we think we're actually looking into that, because of course sometimes it's that we're looking into the corruption taking place in the public procurement process and the ownership characteristics of that company doing that, but also we're looking at indirect ways of how these companies could be used for money laundering and other financial crimes. But yeah, at least for Denmark and related to the age of the companies, the youngest companies pose the greatest risk regarding public procurement. And like I told you, when you have good quality information of the politically exposed persons, you can see that there is a correlation between being a politically exposed beneficial owner and winning a contract with higher corruption risk in public procurement. This could only be done with the information of Ukraine. I think this is something that needs to be done for more countries, because this is also a very logical thing to measure. Like if you're a politically exposed person, it's not that you're banned from participating in public procurement processes, but I think it's a good anti-money laundering and transparency policy to identify the companies that have as a beneficial owner a politically exposed person that are participating in the same time in public procurement contracts. So I think I'm going to go to the conclusions to open the space for questions. I think in the end, we were super surprised that VOs, even though they have these data quality problems, they are high enough in the whole sense as a whole to make systematic and large assessment of risk flagging. Or also we can see that they're having the right kind of errors that we can actually measure if they don't have beneficial owner as a risk in itself. Many widely indicators of beneficial ownerships appear to be valid. And like I told you, I think the risk definitions have to be context dependent or country specific, and they reflect regulatory and corrupt scheme specificities that we're trying to analyze now. So these are the next steps. And this is all. Thank you so much. Sorry, I think I've been talking for a long time, but I hope I was clear. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Irene. No, this is really great. And you know, this meeting goes for 90 minutes. Originally, they used to go for 2 hours. That's when the presenter started complaining that it was too much talking. Beatriz has a question. I mean, I have a few questions as well, but she already wrote it in the chat. But I don't know, Beatriz, would you like to unmute yourself and just go ahead and ask it? Perhaps not. It is a little late here in Japan. Oh, please, Beatriz, go ahead.
Okay, amazing. I have two questions actually. The first one that I wrote was like if you find any like a specific regulatory problem within the regulation of your countries, like for example, like the same regulation giving a chance for the companies to avoid putting information. Like for example, if you can't find, because maybe your organization is too complex, too big, like you mentioned, the characteristics of some of them. If you can't find it, you can put the highest person, like in your organization, the highest rank executive in the company. Like it's of course like the board of directors, president, or the general manager. Did you find any of these cases here? And my second question was about your last slide. You mentioned about the PEPs. You could work with that in Ukraine, right? Was this list provided by the government itself, like, or was this like privately sourced? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beatriz. For your first question, well, I'm going to start with the PEPs. That's something that was created by the NGO where Antonina works. So I don't know if I'm doing another paper on politically exposed persons. This list also poses a great challenge because, of course, what you define as a politically exposed person varies. And it's not only the persons that are in government, but also sometimes their relatives or if they're part of an international organization. So this list also have many challenges involved, but at least the ones we used that was created by the Anti-Corruption Action Sector in Ukraine worked. But yeah, this is not something that was the government. And the first one, I'm sorry, I was taking notes, and can you ask it again? Sorry, it was about the...
Yes, of course. I wanted to know
the regulation, no?
Yes, exactly. In the regulations that you were analyzing, like on this first threshold of what the law is asking in each of these countries, did you find any chance, like a specific written chance for the companies to avoid putting the real information of their beneficial owner? Like, for example, some regulations, they state like if the company cannot declare because they cannot find the information of the name of this natural person, because of the complexity, because of their shareholder structure, they could give the name of their highest rank executive in the company, which is a person that of course works there, the general manager, the BOD, the board of directors president, but actually it is not this natural person, the info that you are looking for.
Yes, and I think like I have to make maybe a slide to explain better the beneficial owner, because for beneficial ownership, it's not only about who owns it, but like who controls So in the case you were saying, just identifying the executive director or the board or director of the board, that would count as who controls the company. So that also counts as a beneficial owner. In cases where you can also don't identify this, at least for Ukraine and the UK, they actually mandate the companies to put a note that they cannot identify the beneficial owner. So this is something that I think should be done for all the countries where you cannot actually find the beneficial owners, to put a note that it's like we couldn't find the beneficial owner, because then it's not a matter of if you're actually complying or not, because of course many companies are not complying either because they're small companies or by another number of reasons. And this doesn't have to be related to a transparency issue. It's more about that they're not complying with that regulation. And sometimes, yeah, like companies, like you said, they're so complex in their ownership structure, they cannot find who actually owns those companies. So I think it's important to have this specificities in each of the countries' regulations to try to say, if it's ownership, if it's control, if you cannot find it. But yeah, in the way I think, like Joseph said, the greatest problem with this policy is the implementation of it. And if you have sanctions in place to try to avoid companies not complying with this regulation.
Thank you, Irene.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Fatima? Fatima?
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Irene, for the presentation. Sorry, I joined a little bit late, so I may not be previewed to the first part of your presentation. So I work at the US Embassy under the Political and Economic section, and my portfolio covers anti-corruption. So for me, I think partly my question has been answered when you were responding to the previous question. It was more on the politically exposed persons and what level those people were at. Maybe the other part of my question was, were these politically exposed persons linked to any corruption cases in Ukraine? Do you have that data? And then the other part of my second question is looking at the countries that you've highlighted. Why did you pick these countries? And then do you plan on having maybe a second data set that will be looking at African countries? Because I'm looking at the context and I don't know if this data can be extrapolated to African countries, because maybe the context and the policies may be quite different. And speaking like in my case, Zambia, this is when we're just starting out with our beneficial ownership laws. We have a lot of companies that are not compliant yet. So I'm looking at that case of a country. Can it be extrapolated like that? Thanks.
Thanks so much, Fatima. Yeah, for the politically exposed persons, like I told you, it's from the NGO. I have to ask Antonina exactly what level, because at least when I did the analysis for another paper, we had to look not only in people that were occupying positions in government, in the executive and the legislative and the judiciary at the federal and the municipal level. And I'm almost sure that this is the same for the list we used for this paper, but I don't know if they also looked into the familiar connections of politically exposed persons for this. But also, like you said, I think for Ukraine, in the paper we mentioned one of the cases that we saw that was analyzed by other journalists in Ukraine that relates to politically exposed persons that own companies in the oil and energy sector in Ukraine that were winning contracts that were overpriced, and at least what this investigation showed, not the most competitive ones. So yeah, we have cases that actually show that what we're seeing relates to a corruption scandal in Ukraine. And for the set of the countries, it has to do with the data, that we have data available for a time range that it actually makes the analysis possible, not only for a year, but for at least several years. So we can actually look at the comparisons in the countries and in the years. And we're actually talking with some partners at Open Ownerships to try to see if we can start doing this in other countries. But like you said, many African countries are starting to create their own beneficial ownership registers. So in the end, if we don't have the data available, we cannot do the matching process, but we would love to do so because I think, like I told you, the risk we're going to see completely vary depending on the country we're analyzing. So we're right now trying to see if some of the most common risk indicators of ownership were valid, but I think we're going to have to start seeing in each of the countries how we measure different ownership risks depending on the corruption schemes that take place. But yeah, I'm going to look into Zambia to see the level of data that you have, but we would love to do this in other countries as well.
Thank you.
No, you're welcome.
Bruce?
Yeah, thank you. Irene, this has been very interesting and very useful. But the thing that came up just now about control, and I know that this often happens in terms of not having a controlling ownership, but that there's a side agreement, the shareholders agreement, which is often used in many countries, which gives usually at the very least a minority shareholder having the power to name the majority of the board of directors, for instance, which gives that person control, even though they're a minority shareholder. Do you work on any of this, or is there anyone that else that's working on that issue of minority shareholdership and yet control, since control seems to be the important part?
Thank you so much, Bruce. And actually, yes, this is something that we try to identify by looking at the indirect ways that these owners are being used as nominees or strawmen of companies. So we're not only thinking about that this data portrays the real information of the owners, but sometimes that, like you said, shareholders that are not actually the beneficial owners are being put as the strawman, as the beneficial owner, even though they are not actually the ones in charge of taking the decisions. So that's why we took into consideration other things like, we're not taking into consideration right now the percentage of shareholder, but this is something that I'm going to keep in mind to see if we can analyze. But yeah, we're trying to detect patterns where we can see if we're actually looking at a nominee beneficial owner and not the real owner of the company. And I think what you're trying to tell me could be also analyzed as a risk indicator of ownership, but not all the countries have the percentage of shares or control that beneficial owners have. That's why open ownership has been pushing so much to try to have this information also in place in these registers to avoid having the scheme that you're describing being used in beneficial owners when you just have the strawman that doesn't have the real control or ownership of the company being put of the beneficial ownership owner of the company in question.
Okay. Thank you. I'm glad and good luck on that too.
Thank you.
Catherine?
Irene, hi, I'm Catherine. I'm also a PhD researcher here at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin, Germany. Thank you for your great presentation, and really exciting to see what research you're doing, which I think is not only deeply interesting, but also has very practical policy implications. And that's what I would like to ask about. So if you're thinking about the latest anti-money laundering directive, AMLD6, hopefully we will see some harmonization, at least in Europe, of BORs. One of the things that you mentioned in the course of your research is that a red flag could be, or risk indicator could be, when company ownership changes very often or very rapidly. And I've had a cursory look myself at some of the country level registers, national registers, and some of them maintain audit trails and some of them do not. So in some cases, you're able to see historical changes, but in other cases, that information is not available. So obviously from your research, one policy implication would be have an audit trail and be able to see how often ownership changes. I assume you're thinking that way. What other sort of big picture policy implications do you see coming out of your research? And thanks again. I think it's super cool stuff.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Yeah, like I think the biggest motivation behind my PhD was that to make the policy recommendations, because in Mexico we're creating our own beneficial ownership register. So I was thinking, like, why don't we look at what has worked and not worked in some countries that have been dealing with this policy for so many years? And yeah, one of the things that you mentioned is one of the recommendations, to have a historical perspective of these registers, because if not, some of the data that we have right now started when the register was created and they don't have a historical perspective. So all of the procurement data before could not be analyzed, and this is a problem. But like you said, also for the changes of the companies, I think it's important to understand how many changes have been done, because of course, this is not something risky per se, but I think it's important to have it because it could be detected as a red flag when you have sanctions, for example, that are being done. And this is something that we saw very clearly, at least after the invasion of Ukraine, how many Russian kleptocrats were changing the ownership structures of many of the companies they had to put them in their wives' names or their children's names, in some cases that we mentioned in the papers. So this is something that it's extremely important to have. We also have more technical recommendations regarding the quality of the data sets, because like I told you, if you don't have a company ID that could be actually matched for the BO register and for other data sets that could be matched to get the most of the risk picture, then you don't have them. But yeah, it's a list of recommendations that I'm starting to put. This about the threshold, it also something that has been done in many countries where they just reduce the threshold under the 25% and then try to avoid it. I think we're starting to see a lot of schemes that are being used in many countries to try to avoid complying with this regulation. And all of these schemes are going to be part of my recommendations. So countries that are trying to implement their own beneficial ownership registers, at least have them in consideration to try to create a better policy.
So we have reached the end of our allotted time, but I would like to be allowed to abuse a little bit my position as host, because I have a very small technical question that I've just been burning in my head from the paper. So the result that you showed us are based on bivariate analysis, right? Because you have 10 indicators and you have your dependent variable being the corruption risk index. And so you're able to show us the impact of each one of these indicators. And of course, it makes sense because you showed us not every country has the data for all indicators, right? Some of them has for a few, others, and so on and so forth. Does that mean that because of this absence of information for all indicators or multiple indicators across all countries, multiple regression analysis or a prediction model based on multiple indicators at the same time, is that out of the question, or is that something that you're reserving for a next step?
I think it could be done as a second step, but by country. And when you start, right now, what we were trying to see if they were valid, like the first step to see if, okay, we have been talking about this ownership risk for a long time in the literature. They have been coming up in journalistic investigations. We're trying to see if they valid by comparing it with other valid indicators of corruption, at least in public procurement. But yeah, now what we have to see now, like I told you, it's like the meso picture and the micro picture. So maybe at the country level, you can do multiple regression. But yeah, I think right now what we were trying to see if these indicators actually were measuring something. But yeah, I think that would be the second step.
Well, that sounds really good. And actually, I mean, that leave us with an idea of what to expect moving forward, and potentially, of course, maybe a follow-up visit to this roundtable series to hear about the results that they continue coming in. It's really exciting because you and your co-author has amassed such quantity of data, and it's very interesting. And we can tell that there's a lot of insight still to be extracted and a lot of the insight that you already have obtained. There's a lot to discuss about them, potentially more a qualitative way. So I'm really looking forward to what you do next. This is already quite interesting. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. It was a lovely presentation, and thank you for taking the time to explain your work to all of us.
No, thank you so much to you, Joseph, for the invitation, and for everyone for the time and commitment to be. It's really early here in Mexico, but I love talking about this. So more than looking forward to participate again in the roundtable.
Great, thank you. Yes, indeed, our European colleagues benefit because it's early afternoon, well, middle of the afternoon still for them, quite late here in Asia. I don't want to take anybody's time anymore. Thank you everyone for joining, and please stay tuned for the announcement of the next roundtable that we're going to hold in August. It was lovely seeing you all. Take good care. Bye.
Thank you.